Hey everyone, so today we'll be taking a look at one of my favorite Nikon lenses of all time. It is the Nikon 35mm f1.8G for FX cameras. So I think it's called the 35mm f1.8G ED lens. And it differs from Nikon's other 35mm f1.8, which is for DX cameras. So today we're looking at the full frame FX version, which is a little bit larger and more expensive than the DX version, as you can see right here. So what do I like about this lens? I like the fact that it's a 35mm f1.8 lens that is super light and small. So if you're a 35mm shooter, you'd know sort of what you're looking for. So on a full frame body, which is what this lens is designed for, 35mm gives you sort of a wider normal field of view. So if you're used to sort of being able to recognize scenes with both eyes and sort of frame them loosely, then 35 is your go-to lens. I usually find that with people who tend to frame a bit tighter, so you're more looking at sort of a concentrated crop on what you're seeing, then a 50mm lens is better. But for most people, a 35 will actually give you more dynamic and interesting images. So you won't get as much background blur and you won't get as much compression for portraiture, but being able to drink in a scene and being able to present your subject in their environment is something that a 35mm lens is extremely good at doing. So that's why you would want to look at a 35mm lens. Now Nikon's 35mm f1.8G is, I guess, their more prosumer type lens. So it's not quite as well built and it's not quite as hefty as their 35mm f1.4G, which is their more professionally targeted and constructed lens. So why did I opt to go for the 35 f1.8G over the 35mm f1.4G? Well, I think that comes from a wide variety of different factors. The first is the size. So as you can see on a Nikon body, this is a smaller type body, so this is a D600, but I also have a D750, which is exactly the same size. And on these cameras, it fits very well and it's very comfortable to hold. So you don't feel like it's going to keep twisting your wrist down and be front heavy as something like a 24-70 zoom would be. You do lose out on 2/3 of a stop, but I think with the excellent high ISO capabilities of modern cameras, you're able to take shots in low light that you weren't able to before. So even though you do lose out a little bit compared to back in the days when you could only shoot at ISO 1600 on film, you're actually still working out to be a bit better off. So I think unless you're shooting in extreme low light fairly often, and you really need that f1.4 aperture, the f1.8 version does almost the same thing for much less cost. It's also a sharper lens and a better lens all round. Whilst this might seem surprising because this lens is only around about 1/3 of the price of the f1.4 version, a lot of people tend to discount the influence of technology. So every time a new lens is released, it incorporates new scientific technology that wasn't available when the older lens was released. So lenses which were excellent maybe 10, 20 years ago are now nowhere near as good as the most modern lenses, and that's due to things such as correction. It's due to better manufacturing processes leading to a better ability to be able to construct things such as spherical elements and make them cheaper. And that's why lenses are getting cheaper and cheaper and better quality every day. So another case of this would be the 50mm lenses. So there's a 50mm f1.4G and there's also a 50 f1.8G. Generally speaking, as most tests have shown, the 50 f1.8G is actually the sharper lens despite being cheaper and despite not being as well constructed. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well. This 35mm f1.8G is actually rated as sharper than Nikon's 35 f1.4G. So taking a look at the lens itself, as I've mentioned before, it's extremely small and light and it's extremely easy to handle. There's a manual focus ring at the front of the lens, but I don't really manually focus, so I don't really look at that. There's also a depth of field scale on the front of the lens, and the manual focus ring is smooth, but still very tactile. And it's also a full-time manual focus override, so you can override the autofocus at any time you want, which is very convenient when you're shooting in high-paced action situations and the autofocus is failing to lock. So looking at the technical specifications of this lens, it has 11 elements in 9 groups, with 1 ED element and 1 spherical element. That makes it a very complex optical design, which is highly corrected and gives excellent sharpness. It's also rear focusing, which means that the front of the lens doesn't turn or move in and out as it is focused, so that's extremely convenient as well. It features an AFS motor, meaning that it works on all Nikon bodies from the cheapest to the most expensive. And it also features a 58mm front filter thread, which is extremely convenient because that shares the same filters. It will share the same filters as the 50mm f1.4G and 50mm f1.8G lenses. Now, who is this lens for? As I mentioned before, 35mm is a bit more of a specialist lens than a 50. Whilst you would expect to find a 50mm f1.8 or a 50mm f1.4 in basically the bags of most photographers, a 35 is usually a bit more expensive and not as ubiquitous as the 50mm. So what does that mean? It means that you know who you are if you're looking for a 35. If you're a street photographer, if you're a portrait photographer looking to do sort of more scenic portraits or sort of more landscape dash portrait type shoots or even group shoots, then the 35 f1.8 is the lens for you. For wedding photographers, for event photographers, it's an extremely convenient and useful focal length if you're not already using something like a 24-70 f2.8. Over the 24 to the 70 f2.8, this lens offers 1 1/3 stop, so that offers more than twice the light capturing ability, and it also offers better background blur if that is important to you. So taking a look at the competition, there's actually quite a few 35mm lenses available on the market, of which this 35mm f1.8 is one of them. The most expensive lens on the market is the 35mm f1.4. That's also from Nikon. In my opinion, if you need the f1.4, you know who you are. So if you're regularly shooting at extremely low light, or if you need the better build quality because you regularly abuse your gear, then maybe the extra investment for the 35mm f1.4G will be worth it. Then one tier down from that, you have the Sigma 35mm f1.4 Art. Whilst the Sigma is a popular lens with a lot of people, I ran into a lot of autofocus problems with the Sigma, so check out my video up here, which I've linked, which goes through sort of a couple of examples and an explanation as to why all this must be happening. I personally wouldn't go for the Sigma, but it's an f1.4 lens and it's super sharp, so if you watch this video and you think that that situation doesn't apply to you, then feel free to go and get the Sigma. I think you'd be very, very happy with it. So coming in behind the Sigma and the Nikon 35 f1.4s is this Nikon 35 f1.8. So as you'd be aware, you do lose 2/3 of a stop of light gathering ability, but I think this lens is excellent value at around $600. So if you don't want to pay more for the Nikon, and even if your budget can't stretch to the Sigma, I think this 35 f1.8 is a great value option that, you know, would suit most photographers looking for a 35. If you have concerns about the Sigma's, for example, autofocusing capabilities, or perhaps how it works in low light and how it's not able to grab focus very often, then I think this Nikon 35 is a safe choice if you're looking for something to use for wedding photography or event portraiture where you're looking for a better low light performing lens. Tamron has also recently come out with their 35mm f1.8 VC lens, which I think is a very interesting choice, but I don't think that that lens is quite at the stage of maturity where it's worthy of consideration yet. I'd wait for more reviews and more user reports before I jump on board that lens, as often these third-party lenses do have some undocumented issues that might not appear until much later on, such as the Sigma issues that I outlined earlier on. So overall, is this a lens that I would recommend? I would say yes, I highly recommend the 35mm f1.8G. If you need a 35mm lens for street shooting, for photojournalism, this is a great option if you're not willing to buy into the Nikon 35 f1.4. It offers some certain benefits which I'm sure many users would find handy and interesting, including lower weight, easier handling, and also just in general a much easier shooting experience without having to worry about having a $1,500 lens on the front of your body. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video and that you've learned something about the Nikon 35 f1.8G. If I've convinced you to buy it, good on you, you'll enjoy that lens. For more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel, and once again, thanks for tuning in today.